And the next presenter will be Christian Bjørndal, Associate Professor from Norwegian School of Sports Sciences. And with the title of Sociocultural Aspects of Coaching, Applying Theory to Practice. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is the mic on? Yeah, I think it is. I'm gonna stand here so I don't stand behind the counter, but I need my notes, I think. Thank you for the introduction, Audi. I'm an associate professor at the Norwegian School of Sports Science, and I used to work as a professional handball coach, and I also worked in strength and conditioning coaching. And now I teach in our sports coaching program, and I do quite a broad variety of research from injury prevention to sports coaching and athlete development. Is it on?
Christian, I think you have to move it a little bit upward.
Is this better?
Yes.
This is better. Or a little bit more?
Yeah.
It's good?
Yeah.
You sure? Okay, so my introduction, I do a little bit of everything. So that's me, both in practice and at the university. Live, where you got one assignment, and then let me know when 10 minutes have passed until it's 30, then I'll close up. Okay? But I need to know where you're from. So how many of you are involved in practice, coaching, or as something else? Supplying, yeah, that's a good bunch of you. That's good. How many of you come from natural sciences, from exercise physiology, biomechanics? That's a bunch of you as well. How many of you come from social sciences, sports psychology, sociology, whatever? Super. Okay, so now I know who I'm trying to reach. I'm not going to talk about the social-cultural aspects of coaching, and I'm not going to talk about applying theory to practice, but I need this thingy. It's there. What I'm going to talk about is how learning how to coach can be advanced by moving beyond disciplinary boundaries. So in my world, I think the separation we do between natural and the social, the subjective or the objective, theory and practice, is something that may limit practice, that limits sports coaching and athlete development. So I'm going to use the next 20 minutes to see if I can kind of get that message across. And I've never done this, I've never articulated this publicly before, so I might dig into some interesting discussions. More important stuff. No. So I think this is super important, because if we look at how you learn to coach, so a lot of you are involved in practice. A lot of you come from biomechanics. You come from exercise physiology. You learn to coach within those disciplinary boundaries. Or you're a sociologist, or you were enrolled in a sports coaching program or sports psych program, and you learn to coach thinking with sports psychology. And based on how we learn to coach, it focuses our attention. So if I come from sports psychology, I see sports psychology everywhere, right? If I come from functional biomechanics, I see the biomechanics of athletic performance everywhere. It influences how we learn to program and design training, right? So if I come from motor skill acquisition, I learn to plan and program training differently than if I come from exercise physiology. It influences how we learn to coach, how we learn to interact with athletes. And it influences us both as coaches and athletes. It influences how we learn to behave, how I am to act as a developing talent or sports coach in order to have a job tomorrow. And in my opinion, I think it is pressing to go beyond those disciplinary boundaries if I am to function effectively as a coach promoting sustainable athlete development, well-being, and sports performance. So for all of you people who come from exercise physiology, biomechanics, motor skill acquisition, whatever, I want you to go home and start reading some social theory. From the few of you who come from sports psychology or sports sociology or humanities or sports philosophy or whatever, and who coach, I want you to go home and read some of Live's research on match analysis. I think we need to kind of get that discussion across going if we are to expand our toolbox as coaches and athletes. And then a point about the social material. I'm not going to say too much about it, but everywhere where humans are present, the social is circulating, it works, it acts as forces, it constrains our way of thinking, behaving, and feeling. You can't extract that. It's always there if there's humans present. But materials, or what we consider natural, is always important if we want to understand learning, performance, or development. So as athletes, we're dependent on our body, right? So the body is important. But the materials, the knowledges that feed into how I design a gym affords or provides the affordances for becoming strong in different ways. So if I design a gym like this or that, it affords different opportunities for development. So the material is also something that is always at work as well. Technologies influence how we learn to coach and how we learn to think, behave, and feel as athletes. If I go out and run long interval, how do you pronounce that in English? Long intervals? Yeah, high intensity intervals. If I don't have my heart rate monitor, if I don't have my watch, how many seconds or how many minutes would you guess I would stop at in the end? And I'm a Norwegian, so that's the background information you'll get. Any suggestions? If you don't put a stopwatch on me, if you don't put a heart rate monitor, I'll stop, and my body will stop after 4 minutes. Because I've run so many 4-minute intervals, because we have 2 guys in Trondheim, you gotta help me out here if that's that. And when Hegerhoff, when did they came up with their idea of 4-minute intervals? When was it? Around 2000. So that was almost at the peak of my handball career. So I've done so many 4-minute intervals, so my body will actually stop even though I don't have a stopwatch. So these kind of, what we think about as social, what we think about as material, we can think about as something that is mutually constituent. All practice is theory-based, implicitly at least. If I go out and observe coaches, I can see some of the implicit assumptions that underpin how they understand learning, development, training science, and so on. And when I coach, I always draw connections between what's what and why's why. So that's how I theorize. So those are not two different entities as well. But if we want to take a step back, I'm going to tell you 3 stories about 3 different sources of knowledge that I was socialized into when learning how to coach. So one is discipline, which basically is the origin of modern elite sport and sports coaching in particular. And I need my notes now, so I'm just going to see if I can figure out where we are. There we are. Okay, so modern sport, including coaching, it grew out of the need to maintain military preparedness through state-led physical education from the Middle Ages and until now. So what we consider modern sport, it grew out of quite different needs than what we think about when promoting sustainable athlete development, health and well-being, and elite sports performance. So a lot of the knowledge that kind of continuously shaped how I coached was based on control, discipline, surveillance, and how I could make those puppets predictable and behave predictable if I needed to call upon them as a king and send them to war. And other professional sport organizations today, for example, football clubs in the UK and in the United States, they originated in state-independent associativity, difficult word, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. And while it's easy to think of those as kind of social, cultural phenomena, it was driven by the scientific revolution, technology development, and so on, that kind of followed the Industrial Revolution. The problem is that a lot of these multiple origins, they continue to affect how we think about sports performance, how we learn to coach, how we learn to plan, how we learn to program. And to this day, if you go and observe professional coaches in Norway, many of them still think that players or athletes like military personnel or industrial workers require, I need a glass of water, authoritarian control in order to be effective or develop effectively. And I think it's clear we can challenge that. So when I learned to coach then, I learned to instill this whole range of disciplinary practices that was basically developed 500 years ago, 200 years ago, 150 years ago to control, monitor, and create predictable behaviors. That's something different than promoting creativity, innovation, something new, something different. But it is super productive because it helps me shape predictable behaviors for individuals and groups. So it's not negative, it's positive in a way. Livet can help me behave predictable together with my humble teammates. But it also is unproductive if we think about creativity, innovation, and what we usually like to consider athlete-centered. All of this stuff becomes black boxed. So when we think about how we coach, if you don't kind of tend to where it origins, where it comes from, the internal complexity and history behind the successful enrollment, it becomes invisible or forgotten. It makes it easier to manage complex issues with multiple points of view, such as coaching as an incontrovertible matter of fact. And the complex processes leading to our understanding of correct coaching becomes black boxed. So with our coaching students at Norwegian School of Sports Science, we use a lot of time trying to figure out where coaching knowledge in cross-country skiing in Norway, football coaching in Norway, speed skating in whatever, where it comes from, where it originates, and what it produces. What kind of intended positive effects does that knowledge produce, and what kind of unintended effects does it also produce? And this is how I learned to coach. This is how I coached my athletes, with a lot of discipline. The other way I learned to coach was by studying at Norwegian School of Sports Science. And when you look at the scientification of coaching that has happened the last 100 years or so, it's been pretty intense. And to make it clear, the scientific progress, technological progress, have rapidly increased sporting performance in a lot of different domains, and it has influenced sports performance, athlete development, health and well-being in a myriad of ways. A lot of them positive. We run faster. We quit sports later, and so on. We develop more effectively. But what helps us produce high-quality science is often the opposite of what makes high-quality coaching practices sustainable for athlete development, health, well-being, and elite sports performance. So using science is different than applying the principles of science for coaching. Can we follow? You sure? Yeah. All right. Let me speed up if I need to. So thinking about the criteria we need to produce high quality science, we don't want to impose that on coaching practice, because when we impose that on coaching practice, we produce more discipline, less creativity, less flexibility, less innovation. But we can use the knowledge from exercise physiology, sports sociology, whatever, and figure out ways of using that knowledge, contextualizing it, and experiment with it in practice. And by thinking about all the excellent presentations we had this morning, it's clear to me that even though we know a lot about training science, it's still a lot of question marks depending on how Live or I will respond to the same exercises during this point in time or that place in the world. So we know some of the principles, but it's not deterministic, especially not when we're talking about individuals, maybe when we are talking about groups most of the time. All right, so point being, make sure we don't confuse scientific quality with high quality practice. And if disciplinary boundaries creates truths, how do you say it in English? Truths, all right? Truths, then we need to kind of broaden the scope of our toolkit in order to gain access to or facilitate access to different possibilities for different people. So we have 3 brothers in Norway who are super fast runners, and if the scientific research that kind of describes their training process, if that's valid, then I know that their training process is pretty scientific. They use a lot of knowledge from a range of fields, but especially exercise physiology, to help them run faster. But there are also fast runners different all over the world, or at least some places in the world, where exercise physiology is not the most important thing that they base their planning and programming on. I think about injury prevention a lot of the time because I work on different research projects related to injury prevention. It kind of illustrates the paradox, because we've never had more research and knowledge about injury prevention in sports. And coming from the sport of handball, we've never had more injuries. And I know that structured warm-ups is different today than what it was when I played 20 years ago, 15 years ago. So we're better at warm-ups, but we're still getting more injured. And when we want to do high-quality sports injury research, we need to maximize compliance, control, and make sure that we can compare different groups with different prevention programs. But when we want to create, or when we want to facilitate athlete development, compliance, control, more surveillance, less flexibility is the opposite of what we want if we want to facilitate high-quality development processes. And going into the last point, I think that my last major influence on how I coach is how modern sport today and the systems we organize elite sports development within is tied to capitalism, and learning how to coach, thinking about coaching as human investment. So free market capitalism is basically the economic system that we have all over Western societies. It started to influence other aspects of society, like education and sports, sometimes in the 1980s. This has led to what a lot of researchers call the commodification of elite sports. You can see that in football, when the main goal is for Christian is to sell me as a football player at the age of 8 for the most money you can get for me, so that you can push that money into your club or into your pockets or whatever. And it kind of shapes, it's a different logic than promoting sustainable athlete development, health and well-being, and elite sports performance. What is tied to that is that it shapes our talent development systems. We become focused on structuring it, hyper-structuring it, some parts of it. We become very focused on efficiency, on examination and testing, on selection and on competition. And I would argue that at some points in time, they are vital for, or could be beneficial for athlete development, but a lot of the times they're not. And my PhD is on talent development, so I figure I have at least read most of the literature on talent development that we produce as researchers. There's excellent research coming out of Finland as well, focusing on how these logics of market-driven invest in me as human capital, get the most money of me, kind of both facilitates and constrains athlete development too. But this is how I learned to coach, but I'm not quite sure if this is how I want my coaching students to learn to coach. Discipline, reductionism, capitalism. Is that the future of elite sports? Or do we need to kind of dig into some of this in order to kind of broaden our scope? These are, I'm going to finish on time, Liva. I'm super happy about that. I'm going to use 5 more minutes and then I'm finished. And so these are a picture of a handball team that I had the joy of coaching some years back. These are some of the players we had in the team at that point. This is Marta. She was captain of that elite team in Norway for some years. Her career development pathway, Astrid, where are you? There. It was pretty common for Norwegian handball players. She attended a very, very good sports school program. She played in a team who was good enough to play in the national series when they were under 18, but they didn't win anything or anything like that. And she wasn't good enough to excel to the Premier League team when she finished high school. She needed to play 1 year in the second tier, at the second level in Norwegian handball, and then got the experience to be called upon and got a contract with her original team. And then after a couple of years, she established herself as one of the key players and became captain of that team. But she quit pretty early. She quit when she was 24 or something. This is Maria. Every talent development activity in Norwegian handball that you can be selected to because we think you're the most promising handball players of everybody, she got selected to. And from the age of 16, she played every match in the first division and then the Premier League for her home team Uppsala until she got a professional contract in Copenhagen and went there and somebody shot her in the head in the first practice and then she had to quit handball. But all activities that you can be selected to because we think you're extraordinarily talented, she was selected to. National teams, international competitions, so on. This is Juna, and I know we have a lot of people from Aarhus here, so I hope that sometimes you go and maybe some of you watch Aarhus United. You do? Yeah? So Juna didn't go to the best sports school program in Oslo. She went to the second best. I was sports director of that program when she went to high school. All activities that you can be selected to because we think you're a talented athlete, you never got selected to anything. So every opportunity, and there's a lot of them in Norway if you're a talented handball player, to get selected to promote athlete development, talent development, whatever, Juna didn't get selected to anything. But by chance, her aunt was on the board for her home club. She grew up in the same area as that team. And when she finished high school, she got a contract. It wasn't a paid contract, but she was allowed to kind of train with the team. And after 4 years, and she got injured, she got pregnant, she got injured, and then the coach looks down on the bench, and then Eunice, the only one left. She was offered the opportunity to play. And it went pretty well. And after a couple of years, she established herself as a key player in that team. She's the only one who plays professionally of these girls today. And in her first season in Denmark, she was nominated to one of the players of the year. She was on the Årets lag, this year's team in Denmark. I think she's been there twice. But at the age of 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, it will be impossible to kind of forecast how these career pathways, how they would move, where they would go. And I think all the stuff we think about when we try to control, make these processes of athlete development, sports coaching predictable, is is fine in a way, but it's still also limiting the opportunities for some of these young, talented athletes to muddle through. Because it limits who it's access to, and sometimes the disciplinary boundaries doesn't give me the flexibility to broaden my toolkit as a coach and coach in different ways. 5 minutes, eh? I'll finish in 1 minute. That's good. Okay. So what I wish for my coaching students at Norwegian School of Sports Science is basically something I borrowed from a friend of mine, Joe Mills. I want my coaching students to learn to think, to learn the thinking and methods used to describe, influence, and monitor biopsychosocial processes relevant for understanding, learning, health, and well-being in sport. That is a problem because our coaching program is at the Department of Sport and Social Sciences. So it's very, very difficult to get access to exercise physiology courses, biomechanics, match analysis, or whatever. But I also want them to understand that the knowledge, beliefs, perspectives, values, norms, practices, which they learn to think as true, real, normal, natural, is always socially produced as well. And they can always be contested. They originated from somewhere. They don't just fall down from the sky. I want my coaching students to move beyond assuming that one truth in any knowledge, in any discipline, one practice, one belief, one perspective is what they need to become efficient coaches. I need coaches who can include multiple perspectives or truths, call them what you want, to include more experimentation in their training, design, and programming, and include less disciplinary practice. And what my coaches, or what I learned as a coach, what I ordinarily learned to think is a problem, is not always a problem. And what we think can change, or cannot change, they usually can change. And what I think is complete knowledge is always limited and partial. And if you can raise that awareness, if I can get my social scientist sports coaching students to read some exercise physiology, if I can get the exercise physiologists to understand a little bit more of social theory, then I get better coaches if I want to hire them as strength and conditioning coaches or handball coaches or whatever. And now I've used my minutes, and I'm going to just say thank you for your attention.
Christian. Any questions? Okay, there in the middle, if there's microphones going somewhere, coming up.
Thanks, Christian, and impressive slides. Your presentation it's a critique, as I hear it, of discipline and predictability in coaching and in training. And you start out with what I think is quite a bold assessment that coaching today either explicitly or implicitly comes from 500 to 150 years of training soldiers and the discipline needed in war, or training factory workers. There might be some more explanations for that in your references you had, but I suppose you could also argue that games, for instance, came out of folk games in villages and really unstructured and rough and tumble play in those fields, but also built that creativity. But you could also lastly argue that without creativity, without discipline, you cannot be creative. I mean, the most time a jazz musician, what he or she does all the time is practicing scales, and those scales are needed to do the improvisation in the concert. You cannot train improvisation without having the discipline to do your scales. So, and coming back to the soldiers again, we know from soldiers that if you are under pressure, when the grenades is raining down upon you, what happens is not that you rise to the occasion, as we sometimes like to think. What happens is that you sink down to a level of training, and that training needs some discipline to be carried through. and therefore discipline and repetition is good and not evil.
Was there a question in there, or do you want me just to comment on it?
Something you may want to comment on.
Yeah, I'm gonna, Oscar, I'm gonna make it easy for myself. I agree, and I think that. So I'm kind of setter noe på spissen. I'm trying to pinpoint a couple of arguments here, and I think it's not about either or. It's about finding the balance, and that is not something I can do today and just do the same tomorrow. That is my continuous challenge for me as a coach. But thinking then about this balance between discipline and more of a less disciplinary practice, I don't have a good word for it either, is kind of one of the key challenges for me to coach, or learn if I want to learn my coaches to coach efficiently. And I think the opposite of that is just that when you expose, it's easier. I think higher education, sports coaching programs in higher education institutions has quite a different opportunities for going beyond and moving beyond and including more or different thoughts about how to coach efficiently. But when you go into the sport federations, they tend to reproduce only more of the same. And at least in Norway and the sports coaching programs I know, I think that is on the kind of the side of more disciplinary practice is better. And then by saying that, there's also some great motor skill acquisition research that's come out the last couple of years where they try and quantify creativity or innovation. And when some of the arguments is or how they can show actually experimentally how figuring out the right level of constraints actually creates more creative behaviors, innovation, than just opening it up or locking everything down. So, for short, I agree. It's not either or, it's both. So.
Okay, thank you, Christian, and thank you for the excellent comment as well. Very interesting discussions crossing the disciplines.